Hello, everyone. We're back now with another little lesson uh, in Matthew on redaction analysis, or Redaktionsgeschichte if you like the German, which literally means redaction history. What we're going to do here is hopefully more briefly than last time. I'm just going to show you another difference with Mark and Matthew in how they handle the parable of the sower. And this is good because we kind of looked at the parable of the sower a little bit when we are looking at Mark. So I'm not going to read the whole parable again just to save time. I'm going to assume that you know the basic parable. The lead into the story is very similar on both sides. Trust me on this. Matthew's a little bit more tightly arranged, a little bit better composed in terms of how he describes the scene of Jesus kind of sitting in the boat while the crowds are along the shore. But jumping down to chapter 4, verse 3 of Mark, Jesus leads the parable with the exclamatory, my translation has listen. Okay, and that's a translation of the Greek akuete, which is just the imperative plural, asking people to listen. But there's also in there an edu in the Greek in Mark, which literally means behold. So Mark has both look, listen. So it's awkward. Okay, it's weird to have both of them there, although it would be perfectly normal to have one of them. If you now look at the parallel in Matthew 13:13, you see Jesus leads in just with a sower, but actually in the Greek there is an edu there. So the translations typically will leave out edu, often leave it untranslated because it's something that you would say often in the Greek to mean behold, but you often, or look, but you usually wouldn't say that in English, modern English anyway. So it's left out. But the point is, Mark's lead into the parable is a lot more awkward than Matthew's. Okay, and indeed, the transition of awkwardness invariably goes from greater awkwardness in Mark to lesser awkwardness in Matthew. Okay, I just wanted to make that point quickly. And again, if you read through the parables, you're going to find some minor changes in the grammar and language, all of which, to the extent that they're significant, is going to point to, possibly some tightening and better composition on the part of Matthew. But again, you'll have to learn Greek to do that. But what I want to show you is the way in which the parables, the parable, I should say, and indeed, given that this is in some sense a parable about parables, how Mark and Matthew, by making slightly different changes, how Matthew takes Mark's presentation of this and does something very, very different. So let's jump down below to the end of the parable. Okay, and so here we are. The parable has ended. And in Mark's version, and again, we went through this before, I'm going to read this to you. It says, Mark 4:10, when he was alone, those who were about him with the 12 asked him concerning the parables. Okay, and he answers, to you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything is in parables. And that's kind of a head scratcher, right? But verse 14 is even more of a head scratcher, because Mark goes on to say, as Jesus says, so they may indeed see but not perceive, may indeed hear but not understand, lest they should turn and be forgiven. Okay, so parables are really for them, not for us. The insiders, the true followers of Jesus, are supposed to get the plain speech. Okay, they're supposed to be the ones presumably with the understanding. But if you follow what Mark does here, it's very apparent that the disciples really don't understand the parables and have to be explained to them. Because when you jump down, you see, jumping down to Mark 4:13, Mark says, do you not understand this parable? How then will you understand all the parables? That should trouble us, because if the disciples are not understanding the parable, are they really disciples at all? Remember, the parables are for those on the outside, okay? And the parables are meant to confound them, the ones on the outside. If the disciples are not understanding, that should automatically bother us, that we wonder, well, how is it that they don't understand? If they don't understand, maybe maybe they're not supposed to understand. Maybe they're really outsiders thinking that they're insiders. Okay, this is the very, very deeply ironic play that Mark makes with parables that most casual readers of the New Testament miss because we're so used to Matthew and what Matthew does. And we'll see what Matthew does here in a moment. Okay? But again, then Jesus goes on to explain the parable here to them. Now, again, why do they need explanation? The parable is not really supposed to need explanation for them because they're supposed to understand. The parable is for outsiders, and they're the ones who are confounded by it, which bothers us. Okay? And again, Mark concludes in chapter 4, verse 33, summing up the parables after he tells two more. I've skipped over the other parables just for the sake of brevity. He says, with many such parables he spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it, but he did not speak to them without a parable, but privately to his own disciples he explained everything. Okay, so maybe it's okay, maybe it's not, but we're a little bit uncertain there about how this is working. But we should really be troubled what happens immediately afterwards, because in this episode with they go out in the boat and the storm gets rough, and the disciples are immediately accused of being faithless, without faith, and fearful. Okay, and if you follow Mark's presentation of faithlessness and fearfulness, you will find immediately that fearfulness is exactly the response expected of the enemies of Jesus, not the disciples. So again, this is a problem, a deeply sort of ironic presentation of the disciples, which really persists in a way all throughout Mark, but especially throughout the first half of Mark until the confession of Peter in Mark 8:27 through 8:30, at which case the disciples begin to understand a little bit, okay, and the misunderstanding and the blatant just stupidity, confusion, faithlessness, fear tends to be featured less often, except it does continue, at least in the person of Peter, and there might be some other examples of it too. Again, if we have more time, we could go through all those, but I want to show you briefly how differently Matthew handles basically the same material. Okay, so again, the parable is not exactly the same, but it's darn close. Okay, Matthew's presentation is probably a little bit tighter than in the Greek than Mark's, but what's different is especially what's after. In Matthew 13:10, the disciples raise Jesus the same question about parables, okay, and they say, why do you speak to them in parables? Okay, notice parables are associated not with us, but them, okay, and he answered them, to you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom, but to them it has not been given. Notice the difference here with this. The secret of the kingdom is given to the disciples in the parallel in Mark, but the knowledge of those secrets is not explicitly given to them. Okay? Matthew is clearly seeing the problem, or his perception of the problem with Mark's presentation, and is cleaning it up. Why? Well, again, Mark is emphasizing the sort of personal failings of the disciples as individual disciples. Matthew is really building up the disciples as the foundation of the restored, renewed people of God, the church which Jesus is going to be founding amidst all the rejection of the original preaching of Jesus in the gospel message. Okay, so again, just a very, very different literary purpose, theological purpose. They both are completely consistent with Christian Catholic teaching. One is about individuals, the other is more about the church. Okay, so again, the understanding in Matthew has to be accompanied with this. That's why they have to not only have the secrets, they've got to know them. They can't be just stored up in a vault somewhere. Okay, continuing on, verse 13:12. For to him who has more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from him who has not, even what he has will be taken away. Notice this is, again, hinting at the eschatological reversal that's going to happen with the putative recipients of the message, which is Israel. They have but don't actually have enough. They can't understand the message, therefore what they have will be lost. The ones who can understand it, namely the disciples who are forming around Jesus, more will be given to them. Okay, topsy-turvy, upside down. He who is last shall be first, he who is first shall be last. That's the standard message in Matthew especially. Verse 13:13. That's why I speak to them in parables. Again, notice, because seeing they do not see, hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. With them, and I'm just going to scroll down a bit, is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah, which says, you shall indeed hear, but never understand. You shall indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull. Their ears are heavy of hearing. Their eyes have closed, lest they should perceive with their eyes, hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn for them and be healed. Okay, so you see here right away, the misunderstanding is not a problem for the disciples if they have misunderstanding. Okay, and it's not clear that they do because they really have the knowledge, it seems like here. Okay, the problem, the parable is really for the outsiders, and indeed it seems to be evidenced of their confusion. Their confusion is why they reject it. Their hardness of heart is why they reject it. In other words, the consequence of the parable will be rejection on the part of Jesus' enemies and misunderstanding, perhaps a mixture of misunderstanding and rejection. But that's a different message than you get in Mark. Notice in Mark, you're not really clear as who the person misunderstanding and who the person understanding is, because the disciples seem to be caught up in the group that are misunderstanding. Again, there's much finer lines that Matthew draws between the insiders, okay, and the outsiders here, and that's the main thing. Okay, continuing on, Matthew also adds this verse, very nice, 13:16 and 13:17, for which there is no mark in parallel. Okay, but blessed are your eyes, for they see, your ears, for they hear. Truly I say to you, many prophets and righteous men long to see what you see and did not see it, and to hear what you hear and did not hear it. Wow. So make no mistake, the disciples are really truly on the inside in Matthew. Okay, no parallel to this in Mark. Again, Matthew is taking this sort of rough and somewhat ambiguous and deeply ironic portrayal of the disciples and really straightening it out, in his view, by pulling the disciples, in unambiguously on the inside of Jesus' ministry. Okay, then Jesus goes on to explain the parable to them. Now, just because they're on the inside doesn't mean that they don't need explanation. Jesus still has to teach them, right? But it's not a problem that they don't understand the parable, because Jesus is going to give them the full truth. Okay, notice here in the parallel in Mark, though, we're making a big deal out of the misunderstanding. Jesus exasperatingly says to them in Mark 4:13, do you not understand this parable? How then will you understand all the parables? Okay, and then he goes into the explanation, and the explanation he gives is very similar in both cases. But again, not only is this a different understanding of the role of the disciples, whether they're insiders or outside, in some ways this is even a different understanding of the role of parables. Parables in Mark have this sort of ironic sort of thing in which they separate the insiders from the outside, or at least make us unclear about who the insiders from the outsiders are. In Matthew, it really does seem like parables are meant to be explained to the insiders and to inflict confusion on the outsiders. Okay, and it's very clear what the dividing line is. Okay, so this is indeed not only a difference between the disciples, but indeed it's a different interpretation of the parabolic ministry, of the function of parables. Okay, of how parables are actually work within the ministry of Jesus. Mark has the sort of unfamiliar, ironic one, which nearly all New Testament readers have never really stopped to look at closely. Matthew has the very familiar one, where parables are essentially the teaching tool, the choice teaching tool of Jesus. Okay, which some people don't understand, others may need an explanation to, but but that's okay because the insiders will get the explanation, but the outsiders will be left in their misunderstanding, right? Because that's why they're outsiders. Okay, they've already set themselves up against the kingdom. They don't get the explanation. They don't have the knowledge of the mystery. Okay, so you see the difference. And then continuing on, you can see again a repetition of what I've said here. In Mark's version of this, summing up the parables at the end of the chapter, Mark goes on to tell us, with many such parables he spoke by word to them. Okay, he did not explain to them any without a parable, but privately to his disciples he explained everything. So again, we're not clear again to the extent the disciples are really on the inside or the outside. But notice the parallel in Matthew. All this Jesus said to the crowds in parables, indeed nothing without a parable. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter what has been hidden since the foundation of the world. So the parables are actually meant to reveal, as well as to define, in a sense, who the enemies are. Okay, the enemies will not understand and Jesus won't explain to them, but the friends either will get the parable, maybe, or they have to be explained to them. Okay, it's not entirely consistent in terms of how the parables are presented in Matthew. Do we always see misunderstanding every time Jesus tells a parable? No, we don't. But the point is that the parables are not a problem for the insiders in the kingdom. Okay, the parables are fine with them. The parables are a problem for the insiders in Mark, because it's really, parables are really meant for the outsiders. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that real quick. Again, how very differently, whether you go all the way with us into the weeds of the synoptic problem, just showing how a very close analysis of the differences in these passages show us how Matthew and Mark can do something very, very different with very, very similar source material. Okay, these are very similar, and indeed, at a casual reading or private reading or sort of liturgical level reading, 99% of people would never notice this. Okay, so anyway, very good. I'll stop there, and I will see you later.